Thanks for tuning in to another episode of our new series, Cryptid TTS, where we detail the profiles of different cryptids and look at documented encounters by witnesses. This series aims to educate people about cryptids and cryptozoology, as well as have fun. So put in your earbuds, sit back, and follow us down the unbeaten path. Cryptid TTS. Woolly Mammoths. Not all cryptids are strange, unfamiliar creatures. Some are animals we've heard of our entire lives but assumed to be extinct since we no longer see them in zoos or on TV. Some cryptid sightings are of animals you would least suspect to still be hanging on, undetected in modern times. Most people would never think that something like woolly mammoths would be a cryptid, reportedly seen alive in the modern age. But they have in fact been allegedly seen in remote areas of Earth's frozen wilderness. To clarify, woolly mammoth is a generic term for several species of large, presumably extinct elephantids of the genus Mammutus. Some of which were covered in long, coarse hair that helped them stay warm in cold climates. They are known to have lived until fairly recently in history, and there is ample evidence to show that humans in colder climates of the northern hemisphere hunted them and used them as a significant resource. Contrary to popular belief, not all mammoth species were enormous. The woolly mammoth species was roughly identical to the Myuu African elephant in size, and some were smaller such as the American mastodon. The largest land mammal currently known is the Asian straight-tusked, but it wasn't a mammoth in the sense of being covered with hair and living in a cold climate. It was however mammoth in size, roughly twice as large as the African elephant. So when we use the term mammoth in everyday conversation, it's a looser term than the scientific names given to species. Mammoths, such as the woolly mammoth, lived in the northern hemisphere of the world in places like North America, Europe, and Eurasia, while other elephant species often lived in the southern hemisphere where the warm climate allowed them to have sparse hair like the elephants we see today. But the northern species like woolly mammoths have become famous through various forms of media and educational features such as television, movies, comics, museum displays, and educational features. Hairy mammoths are almost always the focal point of anything focusing on the Ice Age, as they were the largest animals on the North American continent according to mainstream timelines of paleontology and archaeology. We know from numerous discoveries that mammoths were living alongside at least some humans, and were killed for food, clothing, and tools. We know they were also preyed upon by other animals such as saber-toothed cats like the enormous Smilodon. And they are considered to have gone extinct just a few thousand years ago, give or take a few, due to climate changes and increased pressure from hunting by humans. But in the last few hundred years, there have been a handful of reported sightings and encounters with large, hairy elephants in remote parts of the globe such as Siberia. If there was a population of the giants still roaming the earth, one would expect them to be easily found. But as with many other cryptids, these creatures are reported from very remote areas where few, if any, humans live or visit, and are typically hard to reach and traverse. The last woolly mammoths are generally thought to have gone extinct on Wrangel Island of the coast of Siberia just a few thousand years ago. However, there have been sightings of hairy elephants around the world since their alleged extinction. If even one of these sightings is accurate, it would rewrite our known history of these creatures. In 579 AD, a large elephant covered in black fur was Yanzhou, China. In commemoration of the event, the year was changed to be called the Year of the Elephant. In 1580, a police mission of Cossacks under Yermak Timofeyevich was dispatched to Siberia to restore order at a Stroganov salt mine which was being repeatedly pillaged by brigands. This expedition would eventually lead to the Russian conquest of Siberia. Near to the beginning of the mission, Timofeyevich reported seeing a large hairy elephant beyond the Urals, which the natives told him was one of the treasures of the Khanate of Sibir, which was much valued as food, resulting in the name Mountain of Meat. One of the most detailed and, in some views, most convincing reports of a surviving mammoth comes from 1920, when a Russian hunter recounted a sighting of a pair of hairy elephants, which he had come across in the forest in 1918, to M.L. Gallon, the French consul at Vladivostok. The unnamed hunter had spent 4 years in a region of vast taiga where people rarely ventured. Gallon described him as almost illiterate. He states, "When he mentioned the name Mammoth to the hunter after hearing his story, the man did not show the least sign that he understood what I meant." The hunter told Gallon that, during his second year in the taiga, he noticed a trail of huge tracks, followed by a dung heap. I say huge tracks, for they were a long way larger than any of those I had often seen of animals I knew well. It was autumn. There had been a few big snowstorms, followed by heavy rain. It wasn't freezing yet, the snow had melted, and there were thick layers of mud in the clearings. It was in one of these big clearings, partly taken up by a lake, that I was staggered to see a huge footprint pressed deep into the mud. It must have been about 70 centimeters across the widest part and about 50 centimeters the other way, that's to say the spoor wasn't round but oval. There were 4 tracks, the tracks of 4 feet, the first 2 about 4 meters from the second pair, which were a little bigger in size. Then the track suddenly turned east and went into the forest of middling-sized elms. Where it went in I saw a huge heap of dung. I had a good look at it and saw it was made up vegetable matter. Some 10 feet up, just where the animal had gone into the forest, I saw a sort of row of broken branches, made, I don't doubt, by the monster's enormous head as it forced its way into the place where it had decided to go, regardless of what was in its path. The hunter followed the track for days and days, sometimes seeing where the animal had stopped in some grassy clearing and then had gone on forever eastward. Eventually, he discovered another track almost exactly the same, coming from the north and crossing the original track. From the look of the tracks, the hunter deduced that both animals had been either excited or upset at their meeting, and had then set out eastwards, one following some 20 meters behind the other. He continued following the tracks for days and days, apprehensive that perhaps he would never see the animals, or that they could injure him, as he had only 5 cartridges left in his gun. The weather was also growing much colder, and he could only keep himself warm by drinking scalding tea and building himself a tent of leaves and branches, every night. Nevertheless, he followed the trail, and noticed that he was gaining on the animals, as the tracks were becoming ever fresher. Finally, one afternoon, the tracks were clear enough to show that he was close to the animals. Approaching with the wind in his face, he suddenly came across the animals, and hid himself behind a big large. All of a sudden I saw one of the animals quite clearly, and now I must admit I really was afraid. It had stopped among some young saplings. It was a huge elephant with big white tusks, very curved. It was a dark chestnut color as far as I could see. It had fairly long hair on the hindquarters, but it seemed shorter on the front. I must say I had no idea that there were such big elephants. It had huge legs and moved very slowly. I've only seen elephants in pictures, but I must say that even from this distance, we were some 300 meters apart, I could never have believed any beast could be so big. The second beast was around. I saw it only a few times among the trees. It seemed to be the same size. He set down his bag and readied both his gun and his axe, for protection, and continued to observe the animals. When evening came, it became too cold for him to stay, and he reluctantly left. When he returned the next morning, the animals were gone, and since winter had set in and the weather had become bitterly cold, he gave up on tracking them and left to find a sheltered place to spend the winter. By all accounts, this seems to be a detailed, lengthy encounter with what certainly sounds like woolly mammoths in 1920s Siberia. The hunter tracked these animals for days, finding numerous footprints and dung heaps, which he specifically noted were made up of vegetation. Then, he finally sees them, and gives a clear description of their appearance as hairy elephants with curved tusks. There isn't anything else that even remotely fits that description in the animal kingdom. Either the hunter saw woolly mammoths in the isolated Siberian taiga, or the entire account is fictional. It's curious that the animals would be reported in Siberia, as the area is extremely vast, but also largely uninhabited and poorly explored. The environment can be harsh, but it's also the perfect type for woolly mammoths to survive in without being detected, as the climate and isolation are just what they would need. So, did the hunter encounter woolly mammoths in Siberia in 1920? The Evenk people of northeastern Siberia had well-preserved mammoth scans at the beginning of the 20th century, and faithfully described the appearance and behavior of the mammoth, and even detailed the beast's diet and how they hunted it. A 1922 Russian expedition also collected accounts of living mammoths from the Evenks, including a sighting in which the Evenks had seen one that year, along the Arctic Ocean coast. In 1944, a number of pilots flying from Alaska to Moscow in 1944 are reported to have seen a herd of mammoths walking single file in the snow. A school mistress at a small village near Russia's Staz River claimed to have encountered a mammoth in 1956, whilst picking mushrooms. She said that the animal approached within 10 meters of her. In 1989, again in Russia, a hunter claimed to have seen 2 groups of mammoths, each consisting of 3 individuals. In 1998, a party of gold prospectors reported seeing a herd of mammoths near a tributary of the Indigirka River in Yakutia, which is located in far northeastern Russia. It should be noted that many Amerindian tribes have stories of animals that strongly resemble the description of hairy elephants. Animals reminiscent of elephants, but often formally identified as extant animals, appear in a number of Amerindian stories. Labrador's Naskapi people describe the Kachi Tohusk, a very large animal, identified with a picture of an elephant, which had a big head and ears, big teeth, a very long nose with which it hit people, stiff rigid legs, and tracks in the snow that were deep and round. The bonobos could have described giant monsters with long teeth, which slept by leaning against trees, and a giant extinct animal with an extra arm growing from its shoulder appears in Algonquian myth. Stories such as these are typically identified as referring to animals like bears and moose, yet characteristics such as long teeth and noses, and the habit of sleeping resting against trees, are suggestive of elephants. The animals in these legends are always described as long vanished, suggesting they represent a cultural memory of Ice Age or late surviving mammoths, mastodons, or gomphotheres, and cannot be considered evidence for these animals' continued existence. According to Thomas Jefferson, however, at least one of the traditional animals alleged to be a mammoth or a mastodon, the big buffalo, was believed by the Indians to still exist in the northern and western regions of America. There have been several documented sightings of large elephant-like animals by Amerindians and settlers in North America. In 1567, a party of around 100 sailors under privateer John Hawkins were marooned near Tampico in the Gulf of Mexico. 24 of the men, including a sailor named David Ingram, set off north, and 11 months later, Ingram and 2 others were picked up at the coast of Nova Scotia, some 3,000 miles north of Tampico. Ingram himself was illiterate, so his story of the journey was written down, 13 years later, by Sir Francis Walsingham. During his travels in North America, he claimed to have encountered a monstrous beast twice as big as a horse and in proportion to a horse, both in mane, hoof, hair, and neighing, saving it was small towards the hinder parts like a greyhound. These beasts had 2 teeth or horns of a foot long growing straight forth by their nostrils. Ingram also claimed explicitly to have seen elephants in North America, but he mentioned them independently of the monstrous beast. According to a 1740 account, a party of Louisiana Indians traveling through an uninhabited region came upon some elephants that had perished in a marshy place. They were completely unfamiliar with the animals. In 1811, explorer David Thompson discovered the tracks of a large animal in the snow near the Athabasca River, Alberta, on January 7, 1811. He described the tracks as 4 large, clawed toes 4 inches long, and the prints were 14 inches long by 8 inches wide. Local Indians and French-Canadian trappers also relayed rumors about mammoths living in the hills, surviving on moss and other plants. The most detailed North American sighting of what may have been a mastodon came in 1887. According to a widespread report, a Colonel Cola F. Fowler of the Alaskan Fur and Commercial Company claimed to have very clear evidence that mammoths, or in later reiterations mastodons, still existed in the Alaskan interior. Fowler's interview was covered in the Decatur Daily Republican, March 29, 1897, which gave the Portland Press, November 28, 1896, as its source. 10, but an earlier version of Fowler's interview appeared in the Pullman Herald, July 3, 1891, and Hammerson Peters gives the Philadelphia Press, May 5, 1889, as the earliest published version of the interview. Fowler claimed that in summer 1887, he was visiting a trading station at the headwaters of the Snake River, where he discovered in a cache of ivory collected by local Indians, 2 very large tusks on which he discovered fresh blood traces and the remains of partly decomposed flesh. The local headman, Taliti Ma, assured Fowler that the tusks came from living animals, an old bull and a cow, killed less than 3 months prior about 50 miles from the station. The head of the hunting party told his story to Fowler. He and his band were searching along a dry watercourse for ivory and had found a considerable quantity. One of the bucks, who was in advance, rushed in upon the main body one morning with the startling intelligence that at a spring of water about a mile above where they then were he had discovered the sign of several of the big teeth. They had come to the spring, to drink from a lofty plateau further inland and had evidently fed in the vicinity of the water for some time. The chief immediately called about him his warriors, and the party, under the leadership of the scout, approached the stream. They had nearly reached it when their ears were suddenly saluted by a chorus of loud, shrill, trumpet-like calls, and an enormous creature came crashing toward them through the thicket, the ground fairly trembling beneath its ponderous footfalls. With wild cries of terror and dismay the Indians fled, all but the chief and the scout who had first discovered the trail of the monsters. They were armed with large-caliber muskets and stood their ground, opening fire on the mammoth. A bullet must have penetrated the creature's brain, for it staggered forward and fell dead, and subsequently on their way back to their campground they overhauled and killed a cow Big Teeth, which was evidently the mate of the first one killed. I asked the hunter to describe the monster, and taking a sharp stick he drew me a picture of the pale animal in the soft clay. The Big Teeth was an animal more than 20 feet tall and 30 feet long. shaped like an elephant but with smaller ears, larger eyes, and a longer and more slender trunk, and covered with long, coarse hair of a reddish-dun color. Its tusks were yellowish-white, and there were 6 of them, with an unusual arrangement. 2 were quite normal, 15 long and tapering to a sharp, inwardly curving point. However, the animals also had 4 extra teeth, placed like those of a boar, 1 on either side in each jaw. They were about 4 feet long and came to a sharp point. Fowler also claimed that the governor of Alaska, Alfred P. Swinford, had himself investigated the story, and he was certain from a thorough sifting of native testimony that large herds of these monsters are to be found on the high plateaus in interior Alaska about the headwaters of the Snake River. Mammoths and mastodons, however, do not have 6 tusks, so it's speculated that the extra 4 tusks the Indians reported were actually molars, possibly overgrown. The rest of the description, however, sounds like an astoundingly accurate description of an elephant-like animal. According to an article first published in the Juneau Free Press, subsequently republished in the Grey River Argus in 1888 and the Winnipeg Daily Free Press in 1893, the Alaskan Stikine Indians claim to have regularly seen animals which, from the descriptions given, must have been mastodons. One Indian allegedly followed a series of large tracks until he came across an animal as large as a post-trader's store, with great, shining, yellowish-white tusks, and a mouth large enough to swallow a man with one gulp. According to the report, other hunters claim to have seen these animals feeding along the river. The last account comes from the early 20th century. Frank Graves was told in 1948 or 1930 that 2 men claimed, some years previously, to have been chased into a cave by a mastodon in Canada's Nahanni Valley. This mastodon had enormous spirally curved tusks and very long dark hair. A Dean informant familiar with the Nahanni Valley also claimed that in the valley there lived an animal larger than all others, with a long nose. It should be mentioned, however, that the famous cryptozoologist Carl Schucker has stated his belief that there is no convincing evidence to suggest modern-day surviving mastodon or mammoths in North America. To date, there has yet to be a clear and convincing photograph or video taken of a living mammoth or mastodon, and it does seem far-fetched that they could still be roaming North America without being discovered. It is however possible, and if they were to be found alive today it would more than likely be in Siberia, where humans generally do not travel as it is a vast, largely frozen area. Is it possible that some people have seen extant mammoths in recent history? Or are they all fabricated stories and misidentifications? How could hunters track, in some cases for days, giant animals, get close or even kill them, and completely misidentify something like a brown bear, sheep, or some other mundane animal species as a giant hairy elephant? If any of these accounts are grounded in reality, it would mean that an enormous species of mammal did indeed survive into modern times and that we should investigate further. The real question remains: are they still here? Thanks for watching, and please, don't forget to like and subscribe, and comment your own encounters, as well as what videos you'd like to see next. And don't forget, stay curious.